So in the end, it was more than just a photo op. The 4 European leaders in Kyiv today do support the idea of Ukraine joining the EU, at least for it to be granted so-called candidate status to the club. And that is not the only headline coming out of that press conference this afternoon in the Ukrainian capital. France is to deliver 6 more Caesar howitzers. Those are weapons aimed at re-energizing the Ukrainian defense in the Donbass. This as Russia continues to squeeze the city of Severodonetsk. Tonight on the France 24 debate, a major show of symbolic support for Ukraine, yes, but to what end? Do France, Italy and Germany now really believe that Ukraine can win this war? Or, behind the scenes, is pressure being put on Volodymyr Zelensky to sit down at the negotiating table? Our panel on the programme, Ina Sovsun, a Ukrainian MP and the deputy head of the pro-European party Scholz. She joins us from Kyiv. Thanks very much for being with us on France 24 this evening.
Thanks for the invitation.
From Berlin, we'll be speaking to Danielle Schwarzer. She's the Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundation. Thanks to you as well.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
And here in the studio, I have Oleg Kopsev. He's an associate professor of international politics, specialising in Eastern Europe at the American University here in Paris. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And on the other side of the table, we have Sylvie Berman. She's the former French ambassador to Russia from 2017 to 2019. Thanks to you all. There's lots to get into, clearly, in this hour of debate. But let's start then with a roundup of some of the key events that took place today with France 24's Andrew Hillier.
This was the moment the EU's most powerful leaders came face to face with the reality of war on their continent. In Irpin, which like Bucha has become a synonym for the barbarity of this conflict, they saw the consequences of the short-lived Russian occupation.
Massacres were carried out. We have seen signs of war crimes. It's also a heroic place, because this is where the Ukrainian people halted the Russian army as it advanced towards Kyiv.
It was the first time Emmanuel Macron, Mario Draghi and Olaf Scholz had set foot in Ukraine since Russia sent its war machine rolling across the border on the 24th of February.
We will rebuild everything. They destroyed the nurseries, the playgrounds, and everything will be rebuilt.
On Wednesday, the French president had hinted about going, but the trio were already well on their way to Kyiv aboard a night train when details of the trip finally emerged. Air raid sirens rang out as they arrived, a reminder that they were in an active war zone, something unthinkable a year ago. Later in the day, they sat down with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, bringing with them a message of EU solidarity.
All 4 of us support immediate EU candidate status for Ukraine.
Our country is ready to do everything necessary to become a full member of the EU. All Ukrainian people share this ambition.
And as France announced that it was stepping up its military support, a warning from the Kremlin. Moscow said any new weapon supplies would be useless and wouldn't bring peace.
Well, let's go live now to Kyiv. Our senior reporter Catherine Norris-Trent is standing by. Catherine, we'll get to the news in a moment, but first of all, paint us a picture of Kyiv today. What's the atmosphere been like? Because we heard that this morning when those leaders arrived, there were air raid sirens ringing out in the city.
This is a regular occurrence here in Kyiv, much more so in other parts of the country where very active fighting is still ongoing, but still it's something that people have had to become accustomed to here. So quite often you hear these air raid sirens, a reminder that this is still an active war zone, that there is still an active threat, even here in the Ukrainian capital. Having said that, though, it's very striking here that, well, life is coming back onto the streets of the capital. capital city, at least there are people walking around, having a stroll, having a drink, cars on the streets. It's much quieter than before this latest war, and there is a nighttime curfew in place. But many people are trying to pick up the pieces of their lives as best they can. And for some people, of course, that is extremely difficult. They've lost loved ones. There are a lot of people who've been internally displaced, or people who are returning even from abroad where they fled at the outset of this war. And some people have a huge task ahead of them now to rebuild their homes, which have been blasted into pieces, many of them uninhabitable. If you just go for a short drive outside the center of Kyiv, that's very apparent in suburbs such as Irpin, which was visited by the European leaders today. The damage to infrastructure there is huge, and the task of rebuilding it is going to be colossal. There are already efforts underway to rebuild it. A lot of volunteers, the solidarity we've seen from Ukrainian people, the mobilization throughout this war is continuing, with people literally picking up the pieces of their homes, their neighbours' homes, coming together to do what they can to try and get some of these buildings back in shape, of course, ahead of autumn and winter in Ukraine when the bad weather will set in.
Catherine Norris-Trent, live in Kyiv. Thanks very much indeed for painting that picture for us. Let's stay, though, in Kyiv. I want to bring in Ina Sovson now. Ina, what are your first thoughts today on those images we've seen of arguably three of Europe's most powerful leaders in your city making these pledges? Does it feel like tangible, meaningful support for Ukraine, or is this too little, months too late?
Well, it is less than we are asking for, but it is more than we were expecting in the day before this trip. But I will be honest with you, I did have hopes for this trip. And we were actually, both members of parliament, the president, everyone else, we were asking for the European leaders to arrive here in Kyiv, because I have seen people who have seen images, have seen pictures, have seen videos from Irpin and Bucha, but then actually coming in to see that with their own eyes, to see the apartments which are destroyed, the lives, families shattered. That is changing people. That is changing their understanding of this war. And I really hope that this will change the understanding of the European leaders of the level of threat that Russia is presenting to all of us here in Ukraine, but then also in Europe as well. Yes, I was expecting that this will change their perspective, and it did bring in some good news, because this candidacy status, which might seem like a symbolic gesture, but for all of us, it is extremely important symbolic gesture, because for us it means that we have a future, and that future is within the European Union, and we are welcome there. Of course, we do have to do lots of changes inside, but we are willing to do that after the victory, because that is where we belong. And of course, we understand that there were more talks being held behind the closed doors in discussions about weapons. But even in terms of weapons, France promising more supplies of weapons to Ukraine is again giving us great hope, because weapons is something that we need today very much in order to save our country.
And we will talk about weapons later on in the programme, but I want to focus now on that EU candidate status. Daniel Schwarzer joining us from Berlin. You heard the message there that this is a big symbolic show of support for Ukraine, but what does it actually mean to talk about candidate status? Really, if Ukraine is going to join, it could take years, couldn't it?
That is true. Negotiations to enter the European Union are long, because countries have to basically translate the so-called acquis communautaire, meaning the whole legal body that the EU has passed, into their own national law, or at least make national law compatible with it. So it's a long process. However, the political message is very strong today, and this ahead of the European Council meeting next week. And it is important that those three countries, Germany, France, and Italy, alongside with Romania, send this very strong message. Also because Germany was among the more skeptical countries whether it might be too early and too rushed to provide that candidate status. But now I think the message is set very clearly. And what this now means is not only the political signal ahead of the European Council, which now with a higher likelihood than yesterday, I would say, will adopt the candidate status for Ukraine. But once it gets it, this means Ukraine will get pre-accession support, and it can actually prepare in a more structured way, along with the support of the European Commission, for accession negotiations. And although the war is ongoing and obviously absorbs all energy in Ukraine, it is very important now to continue to tell the country, we see you in the European Union. And, what happened today was a very strong step towards that.
A strong step towards that, you say, but Sylvie Berman, is it actually a good idea if Ukraine joins the EU? Because you're the former French ambassador to Russia. Is there a risk here that will antagonize Russia even further?
Well, I think it's not the problem anymore. I can understand for NATO, but less for the European Union. And, if now there is this status, it's because the war of aggression by Russia. Otherwise, since Ukraine is not respecting the criteria even to be a candidate, it wouldn't have it. So it's the consequence of the war decided by Vladimir Putin.
And Oleg Kobzev, on that, I mean, we don't obviously know what happened behind the scenes when Zelensky sat down with those leaders, but presumably, if for this big, albeit symbolic step to be taken of EU candidate status, perhaps Zelensky has had to agree something else in private. What's your sense as to what is being discussed?
What I think is that this trip may be, I'm not privy to their secrets, but it may be a fishing expedition to see whether Zelensky is willing to negotiate or not at all. If not at all, can they all convince him to eventually negotiate? Not necessarily that they will do it, but they're probably testing the ground to see, okay, how is he ready to negotiate at all? And if yes, is he ready eventually to make concessions? Because let's face it, we're in a situation very much like Finland in 1939, 1940, when Finland was invaded by the Soviet Union, which was quite a bloody war, very much comparable to what is happening now in Ukraine, proportionally, because Ukraine, of course, is much bigger with more inhabitants. But for the Finns, it was just as bloody. Well, the Finns managed to save most of their country by conceding a great part of Karelia. Is that what European leaders are thinking of? I doubt that Zelensky would accept it, but are they there actually to see how far he is, what he is willing to concede to give the Russians just to stop them for now? Maybe in a strategy or a tactic rather of live today, fight tomorrow. Maybe
indeed.
Not that I don't think they're going to convince Zelensky to abandon absolutely all sovereignty over all of Donbass. I don't think that they're certainly not ready to do that, but they might be testing the ground to see what would he be willing to concede. Maybe, for example, promising not to join NATO and promising, opening the doors wide open for EU membership could be a concession to Zelensky, saying, okay, stay out of NATO, but we're giving you the EU instead.
Right, well, let's ask Ina Sovsun in Kyiv, Ukrainian MP. What do you make of that? Is it time to negotiate some kind of peace settlement to end the war?
Well, first of all, it would make no sense, because we cannot trust that whatever we agree upon, Putin will actually deliver, that he will actually do what he promises. Because might I remind you, a week before he launched a full-scale attack against Ukraine, he was saying that he's not planning to attack us. So the trust is not there. And then without trust, it makes no sense to negotiate. But second of all, it's also important to understand that we have suffered immensely because of this war. All of us. We all have our friends, families fighting. We all have faced death of people we know. And that is something that is not easy to forget and forgive. And now is not the time. And we need to make sure that these atrocities stop. yes, we all want the war to stop. But we also understand that if it stops somewhere in the middle, if we get a frozen conflict, that will mean that Russia will attack again in 3, 4, 5, or 8 years. And what we do not want for sure is for our children to inherit this war. We want this war to end once and forever. And yes, it is extremely difficult right now. Trust me, this situation today is emotionally very difficult. The day after tomorrow, I have to go to the funeral of the son of my friend who has been killed by Russians in Donbass. It is extremely difficult for all of us. But what we don't want is to keep on fighting for years and years. We need to be done.
And that is why President Zelensky is asking now for more weaponry. He's making a big point of saying that Ukraine is in some parts of the country being outgunned by Russia 10-1. Now, Western countries have pledged aid, but the figures actually can be rather misleading. Let's take a look at two graphs. The first one here shows military aid committed to Ukraine this year. You can see there the United States, by far and away the largest donor, followed by the United Kingdom, Poland. Now, then things get rather interesting. Germany is next in terms of pledged aid with over 1 billion euros. That a little bit more than France has pledged. But take a look at this second graph. Now, this graph shows, well, it's not a graph, actually, it's a map, but it shows you the commitments that we heard about in that first graph versus what's actually been delivered. And on that, what you can see is that Germany hasn't fully fulfilled its promise to Ukraine just yet. And on that, I'd like to bring back in Daniela Schwarzer, if I can, from Berlin. And Daniela, why do you think that is? Why has there been this gap between what Germany, what Olaf Scholz has promised Zelensky, and what it is that's actually been delivered?
Well, let me start by saying that this is a matter of intense debate in Germany. Because there's indeed this perception that the pledges are there, but the deliveries are late. And the reasons given are some of them technical, the preparation of the arms that need to be delivered, but then also training questions. But given really a very strong public scrutiny, the government has explained when and how they will deliver, and this is going forward. However, the criticism is there that this is too late, and it comes at a political price for Germany, because the trust, not only among Ukrainians, but also among our eastern neighbors who have a very strong fear, of course, of their own security and safety, is, that's very strong and weighs on Germany's leadership at this moment. So I think, first of all, the visit is important today to show solidarity with Ukraine and to show that side by side, Olaf Scholz and Zelensky, speak to the public. That's important as a visible message, but also in terms of deliveries, I'm sure they will have spoken very practically about when those systems actually arrive. In many cases, we have seen over the past month that there was not total transparency on the deliveries before the weapons actually arrived, which is important for safety reasons. So I guess we will learn more in the coming weeks.
And on that, Oleg Kopzev, France today saying 6 more howitzers are heading to Ukraine. Is that significant at all?
Well, I'm sure that in Kyiv, Ina, I'm sorry, Ina, I missed your second name. You'll agree with me. It's better than what they were expecting. I mean, you said it. It's better when what they were expected, but it's not enough. What the Ukrainians need are rockets, in fact, to long-range rockets, so that they can respond to the same long-range rockets that are being shot at them. That's what they really need, and neither the Americans nor the Europeans are making plans to deliver those.
And Sylvie Berman, on the optics of all of this, it's become something of a pilgrimage, hasn't it, for European leaders since the war broke out. They make their trip to Kyiv, they walk around the city with Volodymyr Zelensky. This, though, the first time we've had 4 European leaders going together. Take yourself back to Moscow when you were the ambassador there. How do you think Vladimir Putin will have viewed those scenes today?
Well, of course, he's not happy about it. But again, it's a consequence of what he did. And so that's not a problem. And is against weapons delivery, and the Kremlin is always saying this. And but at the same time, Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and that's what we're doing. We are not fighting Russia. We're not at war with Russia, but we help Ukraine. And when you consider the delivery of weapons, I mean, maybe it's not enough to have 18 Caesars, but it's a lot compared to what we have, really, because it's only 76. It takes a year to build a new Caesar. So it's not, well, it's maybe not a lot. They might expect more, but it's a lot for a country because we need for our own defense to keep some weaponry.
And Ina Sovsen in Kyiv, with that new weaponry arriving, are you optimistic about what might happen in the weeks and months in the Donbass, in places like Severodonetsk? Because from at least where we are here in Paris, it feels like Russia has the momentum at the moment.
Unfortunately, that is true. And we are not optimistic, we are realistic. We understand that as of right now, Russia does have superiority in terms of weapons supply. And what I'm hearing from the military fighting on the east is they're confirming this. They're saying that the trucks with the new weapons are being delivered to Russian army every day, while for Ukrainian side is much less. And I do understand what has been said by Madam Ambassador, that of course we understand there are limitations, natural limitations or technical limitations of how much weapons can be delivered. And that is why it's even more important to understand what specific types of weapons can actually make the change. So the change can come not necessarily because of bigger numbers, but because of specific weapons, which can actually make strategic change. And I agree very much with the professor saying there that missiles that can destroy, for instance, Russian storages of weapons that they are holding in our occupied territories, they will make a great change. And that is why we need this type of heavy weapons, and we need aircrafts. That is an issue that is being not discussed that much publicly. But we do not have air superiority, and we need that. And aircrafts have not been delivered at all to Ukrainian army. That is something that I am absolutely sure President Zelensky was discussing with his counterparts from EU countries.
And Oleg Kopsev, what's your sense as to why it is that those aircrafts haven't been delivered, and how it is that neither Russia nor Ukraine has complete control of the airspace so far into the war?
All right, yes, because simply they do not have a navy. First of all, in the first days, there was a lot of damage done to the U.S. to the Ukrainian Air Force on the grounds. I mean, that was one of the first targets. If you remember, in February, there was a lot of destruction in the airfields and military airfields of Ukraine. So their losses are tremendous. But in the first place, the Ukrainian aviation was not something like the U.S. Air Force or even the Royal Air Force. So concerning Macron, this is where President Zelensky could actually get his ear, because the reason not so many airplanes were sold to Ukraine is that there were contracts in the making with other countries that didn't go well, as a matter of fact. This could be an occasion to do something with French aircrafts that are always for sale. I mean, France is one of the greatest, the top exporters of military aircraft, and this could be a great occasion. Now, it's the French taxpayer who would be paying for it, and certainly not the Ukrainian taxpayer at this point.
Indeed, and we'll come on to French domestic politics in a minute, because obviously the French elections are coming up, and we have this big military fair in Paris right now. But what about German domestic politics? If I can bring you back in, Danielle Schwarzer in Berlin. There have been reports that relations between Zelensky and Olaf Scholz have been rather frosty recently, but also that Olaf Scholz has come under significant criticism at home, even from members of his own party, people saying that he's been rather timid when it's come to the Ukraine war, that he should have visited the city of Kyiv a long time ago. Do you think this visit today will assuage some of those concerns?
I think it will, but what will be equally important is that the German government communicates very clearly what its commitment to Ukraine is ongoingly, when the promised arms will actually have been delivered, and also the other support that Germany gives. Because if you take non-military financial support and you look at the rankings of countries, Germany comes right after the United States, and this is really under-discussed, and it's an important support in times of war as well. So I think there is in part I would say a communication problem, that the actual support is not conveyed in a way that has convinced both the German public, but also our Eastern European partners, and also Ukraine, of course, that there's strong German support. But also in terms of deliveries, we've already mentioned this earlier on in the debate, there are delays, and other countries have been able to deliver more quickly. This is probably a question of early preparedness in our case. But I really hope that, as you suggested, this visit is a turning point, because from Germany's point of view and its interest in this war coming to an end on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, it is very clear, and Olaf Scholz said this very early on in a speech that he gave to a special session of the German parliament early in February, 3 days after the beginning of the war, that this war is about European stability and democracy and freedom as well. And this perspective hasn't changed. So I really hope that this visit is a turning point for a relationship which, in these times where very clearly Germany is on the side of Ukraine, it is important not to have those tensions between the two leaders.
You'd like to say something, Mr. Kopsev?
Yes,
Go ahead. Briefly,
I'm sorry to be critical of Germany in general, and not only Scholz.
Let's hear it.
They should, first of all, they should be much tougher on the Russian gas. They should shut down the pipeline, because Germany so far has been much too complacent towards Russia on this side. So it's very nice to say nice words about freedom and democracy and how great is Ukraine and how we're supporting it, but let's have concrete actions that are not necessarily military. Okay, it's fine to give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need, but also let's be tough on Russia, also on that front, on the economic front.
Well, let's let Daniela Schwarzer come back on that. Danielle, what do you say to that pipeline really shouldn't be running anymore?
Yes, I think energy sanctions are hugely important. The oil embargo, as it has been agreed, a gas embargo would be helpful, of course, to lessen or to reduce or even stop the financial flows into Russia. So I fully agree on substance. For the question of replacement and energy transition, this is proving tricky for Germany. So it's not a decision which you can take today and really shift tomorrow. So part of that is, in fact, Germany's huge reliance on gas imports from Russia. And I would agree with those who said, well, the risk was underestimated over the past years, and the big reliance on Russia was never corrected, even after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where there was a lot of debate in the European Union on energy security and the question of energy sources and distribution within the EU. So I think that mistake was made early on, and the costs of that are now being felt, because this energy dependency reduces the possible scope for foreign policy in this particular situation.
All right, so
there is progress. LNG terminals are being bought and are hopefully operational at the end of this year.
All right, so that's Germany. Let's take a look, though, at what kind of impact this may have on Emmanuel Macron here in France. Ina Sufson in Kyiv. Much has been made in recent weeks of the phrase by Emmanuel Macron, Russia should not be humiliated. As a Ukrainian who's remained in the city, as a politician, did that language by him frustrate you? And did seeing him in Ukraine today change your opinion at all?
I very much hope that after he has seen Irpin, he would understand why such phrasing was unacceptable. Because they did sound a little bit like appeasement of a tyrant, and I do not think he should have used this kind of language. I don't think that he fully grasped on the emotional level how much it touched all of us and how much it influenced all of us. because we are still trying to figure out the number of deaths around Kyiv. We are still finding new and new bodies around the city of Kyiv, literally 20 minutes drive from my home. I could see the lights in Irpin during the March during March month from my windows. That is very close, and I think that when you are experiencing this, particularly for people who are in occupation right now, for people who have suffered so much more, for people who have lost their loved ones, saying that let's not humiliate Russia is just an unacceptable wording. I think President Macron did mean something different, but I do hope that he will be more sensitive to the sacrifices and more sensitive.
He may indeed have meant something different, but either way, Sylvie Berman, she's right, isn't she? Diplomatically, that was a big misstep by Emmanuel Macron using that word.
Well, I perfectly understand the reaction of the Ukrainians, and especially now. I think what Emmanuel Macron had in mind, it was the past. It was the First World War and what we did with Germany afterwards, because we wanted to punish Germany, to humiliate Germany, and then 20 years after, Germany came back, and it was an atrocious war. So I think he had this in mind, and he was thinking also of the future when negotiations can take place. This is not possible now, of course, and for the time being, we really have to help and support the Ukrainians to defend themselves. That is the priority. So I can fully understand, the reaction. I think what he meant, as you said, was different.
And do you agree with that?
I totally agree, completely agree.
There was no sense there that Macron was trying to say, actually, Ukraine needs to cede a bit of territory in order to end this war.
No, that's not what it meant. It may have been interpreted that way, and I perfectly understand that it was. I think that indeed the wording was, it's a problem of communication. It's not exactly the problem of plans. Indeed, exactly like the ambassador said, I would paraphrase that by saying that Macron was either 30 years late, because indeed Russia, that actually liberated itself from the Soviet regime, was treated like a country that lost the Cold War and was indeed humiliated, not as much as Germany in 1918, but you can make comparisons. But the thing is, you can't, once Germany invades Poland, let's say in 1939, you can't just sit on your chair and lament about what was done at the Treaty of Versailles. That's, of course, the point of view of the Ukrainians, and you can perfectly understand that. Macron is also, his intention is that if in the future there is an end to this war, and even if Russia loses the war, and I think that's what he meant, he's hoping maybe it was a way of saying that Russia, we're hoping that Russia would lose the war without saying it so explicitly. That when Russia loses the war, then let's not treat it in the way that Germany was treated in 1918. But of course, it was clumsy, I think.
The problem, of course, though, is that right now, Russia is not winning the war, is it? And Ina Sovsen, perhaps you don't agree with that statement. Just tell me, what do you think? Is Russia winning the war right now?
Well, it's definitely not winning, but neither are we. And that is a very tough situation to estimate. But we shouldn't underestimate the Russian forces, because they are indeed making progress on the east every day, little by little. We are indeed losing lots of military men and women every day, much more so than in the first months of war. We understand that at some point the Russians will run out of weapons. They will run out of potential to attack, but we are not there yet. And in order for us to be there, we unfortunately, and trust me, we all hate being in this position, but it's a matter of survival for us. We'll have to come back to our friends in the EU and in the United States and other countries and ask for more help in terms of weapons.
Your friends in the United States and in the EU, you say, I'm conscious that this debate, in theory at least, was supposed to be about the European Union, so I think we should perhaps talk a little bit more about that. Daniela Schwarzer, is it realistic, despite what's been said today, that Ukraine will join the EU while this war continues? I mean, Turkey has been waiting to join for years, hasn't it?
Well, the process of negotiating membership is very long, even in a country that is at peace with no foreign invasion and attack, as Ukraine is at the moment. So it is no process that happens overnight. And in the case of Ukraine, the conflict will definitely have to be settled. The country needs to be at peace to enter the EU. But nevertheless, the signal is so important that the EU clearly shows not only Volodymyr Zelensky as the president of Ukraine, but essentially also the neighborhood and Russia, that it counts on Ukraine as a European country that wants to integrate into the European Union and in that way strengthen its commitment to democracy and rule of law, because that's what the union stands for. And that is part of what Vladimir Putin is fighting, because having a country on his doorstep that went through a transition towards a democracy is obviously something that, given his model, his autocratic model of ruling, even having now dictatorial traits, is very difficult to accept for him.
And Sylvie Berman, I mean, Macron, not today, but earlier on, had talked about this idea of a second-tier membership of the EU. Can you tell us a bit about what that means and how well you think that might go down in Ukraine?
Well, I think in Ukraine they understood that it was an alternative to the status. I think it's different. It's because it will take time, and it will inevitably take time because you need some convergence. You need some convergence on the judiciary, on corruption, and we know there's a high level of corruption in Ukraine. And so, in the time being, there would be a possibility to have more cooperation, more rapprochement in a certain way to the EU, and it doesn't mean that they won't join the EU. That was the idea. It concerned a lot of countries and all the candidates and possible candidates. And Emmanuel Macron also referred to the UK. I'm not sure they're interested, but that's what he said. He said, and even those who left. And the ideas are always been in the past to have some concentric circles and in order to either prepare those countries who will join or cooperate with countries who won't join. So that was the idea, but it has been interpreted as a way not to accept this status.
Ina Sovson in Kyiv, how does that sound to you? A second-tier membership of the EU, would that suffice?
No, that would not. But we are realistic, and I agree with the colleagues from the studio in assessing how long it will take to become full members. We are aware of that. I just want to say that we shall not come knocking on your door saying in a month, saying like, now we want the membership. We understand that membership will take time. And that will depend on how well we shall be doing in terms of convergence with legislation, in terms of reform of judiciary, in terms of fighting corruption. Our party is very tough on corruption. We do believe that we need to take a tougher stance in fighting corruption, and we recognize this as a problem. We understand it will take time. And we understand that in the meanwhile, there needs to be some sort of structured dialogue between European Union and Ukraine. And I think that was something that Emmanuel Macron was suggesting. But again, as with the let's not humiliate Russia phrasing, I think there was the problem with delivery. And that is one of the reasons why I'm very much hopeful that direct communication between the two presidents today actually helped solve those issues which could have been of communicative nature, not necessarily of different intentions.
I'm really interested that you mentioned corruption there. Obviously, Ukraine is in the middle of a war, not the top priority right now, but just give us a sense when we're talking about corruption in Ukraine, what are you talking about and what needs to be done on that front in order for Ukraine to join the EU?
Well, we have actually launched several anti-corruption reforms because, yes, we do recognize that corruption is there. Corruption is basically of two types. There is high-level corruption, and then there is everyday corruption and bribery. And of course, what we need to focus is high-level corruption, making sure that people who are holding power, if they violate their power, they are held responsible. And unfortunately, as of right now, that is not necessarily the case. We didn't have the high-profile cases where people of held in high positions being persecuted and put to jail for corruption, even if we know that from different investigations that they needed to be held responsible. That is something that we need to work on. And trust me, I'm here as a Ukrainian MP. I can tell you for sure, we know of that problem. We know that is something that needs to be done. And I also think that is something that President Zelensky had to be discussing with his counterparts from the EU, because that is a big issue. And we understand we can never fully be member of European Union unless we solve the problem of high-level corruption. So that is something that needs to be tackled. It will not be easy because vested interests are there, and sometimes they control some politicians, sometimes they control some parts of government. That is a problem, but I think it's important to recognize the problem in order to be able to solve it. So I'm telling you that we recognize the problem, and I'm absolutely sure that particularly after the war, there will be people coming back from war, the veterans, the volunteers, paramedics, everyone else, who have this extreme feeling of justice. Mm-hmm. And they will not allow for injustice of corruption to continue. I'm absolutely sure of that.
Ina Sovson, thanks very much for talking to us a bit about that. Let's turn our eye briefly, if we can, at the end of this programme to domestic politics here in France. It's parliamentary elections on Sunday. Emmanuel Macron needs to do well if he is to keep hold of his parliamentary majority. Oleg Kopsev, foreign policy, normally not a big issue during election campaigns, but perhaps in this one it really matters, and perhaps today would have made a difference for Macron in the polls. What do you think?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think we underestimate how many Frenchmen have doubts about supporting Ukraine, about criticizing even Putin. There are many more pro-Putin Frenchmen, left and right, as a matter of fact, than we actually realize it. It's also this is a much wider issue. It's because you have the middle classes in general feel that they are losing their grip, on that they're being declassified socially. So that is why you see all of this populism and even extremism rising worldwide. Whether it's Brexit in England, whether it's extremist right-wing groups in Germany who even managed for the first time to enter parliament.
What about here in France on Sunday?
And here it's not just, it's not just Marine Le Pen on the extreme right and Mélenchon on the extreme left who have very ambiguous positions towards what is happening in Ukraine, or towards in the attitudes towards Russia that France needs to adapt. Look, you had the grandson of General de Gaulle, I think it's Philippe de Gaulle, who just either today, this morning, or yesterday went to the Russian. It was the 14th of June, and basically all he did was trash NATO. So I agree. NATO does have a tremendous responsibility. They have provoked a lot, but provoking the crime doesn't justify the crime, of course. But that's not what I didn't hear. I don't hear that from those who do criticize NATO. Indeed,
we've got about a minute left. Sylvie Bergman, let me bring on that. What do you think? This all played well for Macron on Sunday?
I don't know. I'm not sure it will have consequences. For the time being, he's criticized by the left, by the right, but it's just a principle, damn if you do, damn if you don't. Because if he hadn't been to Kyiv, he would have been criticized and saying that France doesn't have a role anymore in the world. And this time he's going there with three other leaders of European countries, is doing a lot and is criticized because of the upcoming elections. So there's always a contradiction and there's always a pretext for the opposition.
We've got about 30 seconds. Give it to us very quickly.
The majority of the French are supporting Ukraine. I want to reassure Kyiv that I see on the screen. Don't worry about that. The majority does support, and I think it's good that he went to Kyiv because that will boost those who do support those kind of policies, even if Macron himself is not completely, they're not sympathetic towards President Macron himself.
Well, we'll see, obviously, what happens on Sunday. But that is it for the France 24 debate. I want to thank my guests in Germany, in Kyiv, and also here in the studio. It's been a real pleasure to have you all. The news continues shortly here on France 24. But from me, good night.